The coffee had gone cold, untouched on the edge of Ethan Reyes's mahogany desk. Morning sunlight crept through the panoramic windows of his office on the top floor of the Reyes Tech Tower, painting jagged golden lines over steel and glass as the city below stirred to life. Ethan, however, stood still, a tall, composed figure in a charcoal suit, his hand resting lightly against the glass, eyes tracing the horizon with the same quiet intensity that once built an empire. On the surface, nothing about this moment appeared unusual, just another morning in the life of one of the decade's most celebrated tech magnates. But the truth sat silently in front of him, wrapped in a gold envelope whose presence demanded more attention than any investor meeting or merger. Inside was the invitation, a meticulously designed piece of white cardstock embossed with silver foil that bore the name Dr. Lena Cruz. It had taken him weeks to rehearse the call, yet now that it was time, his fingers hovered over the phone as if the device itself held the weight of history. Finally, with mechanical precision, he dialed. The line clicked once, then twice, and a receptionist answered in the practiced tone of a pediatric hospital. "Good morning, Children's Medical Center." "May I speak to Dr. Cruz?" Ethan asked, steady but firm. "One moment, please." As he waited, he turned again to the view, to the empire built from a college dorm idea turned multi-billion-dollar corporation. 35, Forbes featured. Suited in Italian wool, a man at the pinnacle of global influence. But the call he was about to make wasn't about power or business. It was personal. And beneath the polished surface of confidence, something else stirred. A knot in his chest that even he couldn't quite define. Then her voice. "Dr. Cruz." A pause passed, brief but electric. "Lena," he said, attempting casual, though the tightness in his throat betrayed him. "It's Ethan." What followed wasn't silence exactly, but recognition. It stretched just long enough to confirm that she had indeed not forgotten him. "Well," she said eventually, her voice layered with caution. "That's a surprise. It's been 6 years. 6 years, 2 months, and 17 days, he replied, before instantly regretting. The detail, too exact, too telling. From the silence that followed, he knew she heard everything in the numbers. "I'm getting married," he continued, "in 3 weeks. Another pause, this one longer, heavier. "You're inviting me to your wedding?" "Yes," he said. "Camille and I are bringing together the most important people from our lives. You were significant." That last word dropped with an almost painful finality. As he spoke, his fingers unconsciously brushed the envelope on his desk, as if reaffirming the choice. What Lena didn't know, what no one knew, was that this wasn't a gesture of reconciliation. Camille Laurent, supermodel and current face of several luxury brands, was his perfect partner in optics. Their union was strategic, glossy, built for headlines and shareholder confidence. But inviting Lena Cruz was a move in a very different game, one built not on affection, but quiet vengeance. "I'm surprised," Lena said at last, though her tone was unreadable. "But thank you. I'll try to attend." "Perfect. You'll receive the formal invitation tomorrow." He hung up before the pause became unbearable, allowing himself a slow, measured exhale. Across the room, his assistant stepped in holding a tablet, her presence brisk and efficient. "Mr. Reyes, Ms. Hale is waiting for you in the conference room." He nodded once, straightened his cufflinks, and walked away from the envelope that had just reopened a chapter he'd sworn shut. But what he couldn't see, what none of them could, was that in a different part of the city, someone else had been holding on to a truth for 6 years that would soon dismantle the carefully controlled world he had built. Lena Cruz stared at the silent phone in her office, as if its plastic shell might still burn her fingers. The voice she hadn't heard in years echoed in her mind, deeper now, colder maybe, but undeniably his. The past rushed at her all at once, the kind that crept up not with memories, but with sensation, a twist in the gut, a pressure behind. The eyes, the ache of old wounds. She glanced toward the bookshelf, where 3 small photo frames sat quietly above her desk. Inside each, a 5-year-old boy smiled at the camera, identical in face but different in expression. One serious, one mischievous, one soft-eyed and dreamy. Her sons, Noah, Leo, Eli, Ethan's sons, though he didn't know it. A dry laugh escaped her lips, disbelief dressed as amusement. His wedding, after 6 years of silence? And now, an invitation. She remembered trying to contact him once. Just once. The boys were barely a year old. She'd attached pictures, explained everything, even asked for nothing, just honesty. The response had been swift and devastating. A message from Victoria Hale, his longtime executive, dismissing her. Entirely. Please cease all attempts to contact Mr. Reyes. He has moved on. Any claim of paternity would be damaging to his image and the company's stability. After that, she stopped trying. If Ethan allowed someone else to handle matters so personal, she could only assume he wanted nothing to do with them. Now, years later, he was inviting her to his wedding. Teresa, her nurse, knocked lightly. "Dr. Cruz, your next patient is ready." Lena nodded, gathering her composure. "One moment." She stood, walked to the shelf, and gently touched the glass of the photo frame holding her 3 boys. They didn't know who their father was. Not yet. She'd kept their lives simple, safe, focused on love, structure, and truth. The truth that some fathers simply weren't present. But now, the rules had changed. And maybe they deserved to see him. Maybe he deserved to see them. Or maybe, just maybe, she wanted him to. This wouldn't be about revenge. It would be about justice. And about the 3 boys whose futures would no longer be shaped by a lie of omission. She would attend the wedding, and she would not be alone. That night, high above the city in a penthouse of glass, stone, and silence, Victoria Hale watched the lights flicker in the streets far below. In one hand, a glass of wine. In the other, a phone. A message had arrived. Ben saw her. She's coming, and she's not coming alone. Victoria exhaled slowly, walked to a sleek cabinet, and unlocked a drawer, labeled only LC. Inside were the artifacts of a war she'd waged in secret. Letters never delivered, sonograms never seen, photos of babies who should have grown up known. 6 years ago, she had buried a truth to preserve the empire she and Ethan built. Because, back then, they had been on the edge of greatness, negotiating their first billion-dollar deal. There was no room for scandal, no room for a child, and let alone 3. She'd done what had to be done. She told herself that then. But tonight, looking down on a city that had begun to whisper, Victoria knew the past had claws. And it was coming. For them all. The envelope rested in the center of the kitchen table like an artifact unearthed from a life that no longer existed. Gilded edges and a calligraphed name whispered of luxury, of control, of a world Lena Cruz had chosen to leave. Behind 6 years ago, when ambition had outweighed affection, when she had looked into the eyes of a man she once loved and understood, there would never be space for both his dreams and her existence. Now that same man had resurfaced, not with an apology, not with remorse, but with an invitation. A wedding, his wedding, and he wanted her there. In the calm of morning light, she watched her 3 boys descend one by one from the stairs, each dressed in unmatched pajamas, each carrying pieces of their small, buzzing lives. A stuffed dinosaur, a paper airplane, a dog-eared music sheet. Leo was the first to speak, eager to go to the park, and already bargaining to bring his toy. Noah followed, always measured, always a voice of reason among chaos. Eli came last, quiet as usual, but his eyes landed briefly on the envelope, curious. She hadn't told them anything yet, but soon she would have to. As they ate breakfast, Chattering over cereal and debating the hierarchy of superheroes, Lena's thoughts drifted away from the rhythm of their voices and toward the weight of the choice in front of her. Not whether to attend, that had been decided the moment she heard Ethan's voice, but how. How to walk into a ballroom of curated elegance with 3 5-year-old boys who carried his face like mirrors she could no longer hide. She had spent years sheltering them from disappointment, from absent expectations, from questions with no kind answers. But the past had arrived dressed in white and gold, and the time for silence had ended. Later that day, she found herself in a part of town she rarely visited. Boutique storefronts gleamed with polished glass, and inside one, rows of miniature suits and shoes lined up like soldiers awaiting inspection. It felt surreal, dressing her children for a wedding not their own, for a man they didn't yet know, for a moment that might upend everything they had learned about family. She requested 3 identical suits, navy blue, tailored to fit the lean frame of boys who had grown fast and full of life. While the clerk disappeared to find options, the boys played with a train set near the window, unaware of the weight circling just beyond their laughter. The sound of her name spoken from behind drew her attention, and when she turned, she saw a familiar face from another lifetime. Ben Carter, a friend from university days, stood with the tentative surprise of someone unsure whether to smile or offer condolences. They hadn't spoken in years, not since long before the boys were born, but it was clear from the way his eyes shifted from her to them and back again that recognition was dawning. Triplets, the resemblance, the math. It took him less than a minute to piece it together. She confirmed it with calm certainty, offering the truth without apology. Yes, they were Ethan's. No, he didn't know. And yes, she had tried once, an email, with photos, with honesty, sent at a moment of vulnerability and hope. The reply had come not from Ethan, but from his executive, efficient and cold. Don't contact him again. Not now. Not ever. The company comes first. Ben's reaction was quiet, thoughtful. He recalled a conversation with Ethan months ago, over drinks, where her name had come up. There had been resentment in his tone, a hint of unfinished business cloaked in pride. Perhaps this invitation wasn't so much reconciliation as it was spectacle. A performance for the one who didn't stay. She nodded. That was her suspicion too. He offered his support, his card, and she thanked him. When he left, she returned to her sons, who were now admiring themselves in tiny jackets with gold-stitched initials. They beamed at their reflections. To them, it was just dress up. But to her, it was the first step into a future that none of them could fully predict. Across the city, on a floor high above the blur of traffic and time, Ethan Reyes sat in a glass-walled conference room while the final presentation for the Artec Horizon OS flickered across a digital screen. Words filled the space, projections, metrics, timelines, but none of them touched the place his mind had gone. The call with Lena echoed in his memory, not as dialogue but as emotion, as the slight quiver in her voice when she realized who he was and what he wanted. Victoria Hale sat across from him, sharp in her tailored suit, reading him as easily as a spreadsheet. She already knew. She always did. The conversation pivoted without warning. Lena, the invitation, whether she had accepted. He offered vague answers, but she saw through them. Victoria's concern wasn't emotional. It was strategic. A woman like Lena walking into a high-profile wedding during a major product launch introduced variables that couldn't be controlled. She reminded him of what they had built, of the image they had crafted, one built on precision, not ghosts. Ethan assured her it was personal, just a closing of chapters. She didn't believe him, and maybe, beneath his carefully chosen words, neither did he. That night, Ethan sat alone in his apartment, the city sprawling out beneath his windows, more distant than ever. The walls around him gleamed with modern design, but None of it felt solid. He searched for Lena online, not obsessively, but with quiet desperation. There she was, pediatric specialist, published author, hospital leader. And then he found it a community paper, small and local, with a photo of Lena holding a plaque. The caption was simple. Dr. Lena Cruz, mother of triplets. The room narrowed, his breath caught. The year of the article, the math, the timing, it all aligned. Triplets, 5 years old. He did not need to see their faces to know. The image was already printed in his memory, in his DNA. He closed his eyes and pictured them. What they might look like, what they might already know, what they had never been told. Across the room, in a drawer left untouched for years, rested an old photo. Him and Lena, by a lake, sunlight warming their skin, her laughter frozen in time. She had loved him then, and he had let her go, assuming ambition would be enough to fill the silence. But now the silence had ended, and it was coming back in threes. The day after discovering the truth, Ethan woke before dawn, long before the city below began its slow stretch into morning. He stood at the window of his penthouse, coffee cooling. In his hand, the skyline no longer a symbol of dominance but a fragile outline drawn above the deep fault lines of his past. Somewhere down there, 3 lives moved forward unaware of the tidal shift now forming in the distance. 3 small beings with his eyes, his stubbornness, his blood, existing for 5 years without his name, his voice, his presence. The thought was unbearable. The silence had become a storm. By mid-morning, the office felt suffocating. Polished glass, quiet elevators, smiles that didn't reach eyes. Every hallway conversation, every scheduled meeting, every precisely managed hour seemed irrelevant now. He passed through it like a ghost in tailored fabric, nodding when expected, signing what was handed to him. But his mind existed elsewhere entirely. It was no longer a matter of speculation. He had children. Not 1, not 2, 3. And somehow, that truth had been buried in a place he once believed was invulnerable, the foundation of his own success. At home that night, with every screen off and every light dimmed, he spread the evidence before him like relics. The photo from the newspaper, a screenshot of the caption, a map to the park near Lena's address, where he imagined they might go. Then he retrieved a folder from a locked drawer, the same folder that had remained unopened for years. It contained the only photo he and Lena had ever framed together. In it, they stood beside a lake on the edge of fall, his arm wrapped around her as she leaned back into his chest, laughing at something he couldn't remember anymore. He stared at it for a long time, realizing that the man in the picture had no idea what he was about to lose. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sent a message to his assistant, instructing her to discreetly confirm Lena's attendance at the wedding. The reply came minutes later. She had RSVP'd. 3 guests, no names provided. Ethan read the words over and over. The confirmation felt less like control and more like consequence. There would be no avoiding the moment. Not now. The curtain was already rising. Elsewhere, in the warmth of her home, Lena sat cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by crayons, scissors, and the scent of freshly baked cookies cooling on the counter. The boys had decided without warning to create something special for the important day, even though they still didn't fully understand what it was. To them, it was just another outing, another chance to wear something nice, see something new. But Lena had noticed the subtle shift. The way Eli had started asking more about his drawings, wondering aloud whether his music could be played for someone new. The way Noah had asked, for the first time, if other kids had parents who didn't live together, and Leo, ever the fearless one, had boldly asked why they didn't have a dad like Mateo's or Julian's. She answered carefully, truthfully, that there was someone, that they hadn't met him yet, that he didn't know they existed. Until now. And though the children nodded and carried on with their coloring, She saw how the words lingered behind their eyes, quietly rearranging the stories they had come to believe about the world. By the time bedtime arrived, she was exhausted, in the way only single parents understood. Not just physically, but emotionally stretched, mentally pulled between certainty and doubt. Still, she stood quietly at the threshold of their shared room as they slept, observing the little rise and fall of 3 small chests, the half-opened books at their sides, the stuffed toys nestled in a chaos of blankets. A storm was coming, but for now, they were at peace. She intended to protect that peace for as long as she could. 2 days before the wedding, the suits were ready, pressed and hung, waiting for small shoulders and restless limbs. Lena found herself standing in the boys' closet, running her hand along the fabric, wondering if anything could truly prepare her for what was to come. She didn't want revenge. She didn't crave redemption. But she believed in truth. And the truth was that these children deserved to be known, to be acknowledged, to be seen in the full light of the world. Whether or not Ethan was ready no longer mattered. They were. The following morning brought a flurry of logistics. Her mother arrived early, offering to take the boys out for the day, while Lena finalized preparations. She sat at the kitchen table afterward, sipping cooling tea, staring at the wedding invitation once again. Its embossed letters gleamed in the light. It was absurdly beautiful, the kind of stationery that promised perfection, curated smiles, a beginning. But beginnings, she had learned, were never so neat. With the boys gone, she returned to the box she had kept locked in the back of her closet. Inside were the ultrasound images from that final trimester, 3 tiny silhouettes in orbit, each distinct yet impossibly connected. She hadn't looked at them in years. The memory of sending a scanned version in an email still burned. The reply had been swift, unsigned, clinical. Please refrain from further contact, for the good of everyone involved. That had been the end, or so she believed. That evening, the boys returned from the park with stories of ducklings and muddy sneakers. Leo had a new scrape on his knee, proudly displayed. Noah carried a pressed leaf, explaining its veins and color. Eli, of course, had been quiet, watching the others with the same composed observation that Lena recognized in herself. They had no idea how close they were to crossing into a version of reality none of them had asked for. The next morning, she received a call from an unfamiliar number. For a moment, she debated whether to answer, but instinct told her it was time. She picked up, heart already quickening, and a voice she had tried to forget spoke her name. There was no greeting, no introduction. Only a pause, then a statement. He knew. He had found the article, had confirmed the math, had confronted the silence. Lena said nothing at first, letting the words fall between them. Then came the question. The one she had asked herself 1,000 times. Why had she never told him directly? Why had she allowed someone else's rejection to become final? Her voice was calm when she explained. She had tried, and she had been met with silence disguised as protection. His silence. His world. He asked their names. She told him Noah, Leo, Eli. Then there was only breathing on the other end of the line, ragged, uneven, the sound of someone rearranging their own identity. He asked to meet them. She hesitated, not out of spite, but out of fear. Not for herself, but for them. And yet, when she looked at her sons, now tangled in the limbs of sleep once more, she realized the decision had already been made. She agreed. And when the call ended, she stood still for a long time, knowing the next chapter had already begun writing itself, not with declarations or promises, but with 3 little names whispered into the ear of a man who had finally stopped running from what mattered most. The sun climbed slowly over the horizon, they say. Next morning, casting a gold-tinted haze across the glass walls of Ethan's penthouse. For once, he didn't start his day with news briefs or calls to Asia. There were no boardroom agendas or pre-market reports. Instead, he stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of his shirt, his reflection staring back with a mix of quiet apprehension and unfamiliar humility. The suit he wore today was deliberately casual, open collar, soft jacket, no tie. He wanted to look human, approachable, not the headline version of himself, not the billionaire, not the mogul. Just a man, a father if he could be. He had asked Lena to choose the place, and she had suggested the park by the lake, neutral ground, familiar to the boys, open and unthreatening. It was the kind of place where children laughed without fear and ran without being told to slow down. As he drove, each passing block seemed to loosen some invisible knot in his chest, yet his hands remained tight around the steering wheel. For years, he had chased control, clarity, measurable outcomes. But this morning, all he could carry with him was uncertainty and the aching weight of time lost. The park emerged ahead, framed by trees beginning to blush with the first hints of autumn. He parked, stepped out, and exhaled slowly, as if breathing could somehow slow his pulse. Then he waited, eyes fixed on the winding path that led from the street, the world holding still in the quiet between heartbeats. It didn't take long. Lena appeared first, walking at a steady pace, and beside her, 3 boys, not running, not skipping, just walking with the kind of calm that belied their age, as if they too sensed that something unspoken hovered in the air. Noah walked closest to his mother, straight-backed and observant. Leo strayed slightly ahead, occasionally pointing toward a squirrel or bird, narrating small discoveries with energy that didn't pause for punctuation. And Eli remained just a step behind, eyes scanning everything, his small hand occasionally reaching for the edge of Lena's coat, as if to steady himself in a world that was shifting beneath his feet. Ethan watched them approach, and for the first time in years, the sound of footsteps on gravel made his chest tighten. He hadn't rehearsed this. No speech would suffice. No plan could account for the reality of the moment. When they stood a few feet away, time seemed to fold inward, the present colliding with all the unseen yesterdays that led to this single meeting. He lowered himself to one knee, not because anyone told him to, but because it felt right, an instinct stronger than pride or fear. Introductions were gentle and simple. Lena spoke first, bridging the silence with calm warmth. The boys took cautious turns, stepping forward. Noah spoke with the formality of someone twice his age, offering a handshake and stating his name with the kind of clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. Leo bounced on his heels, his energy barely contained, curious about Ethan's shoes, his watch, even his hair. Eli lingered until the very end, quiet and watchful, and when he finally met Ethan's gaze, it was not with suspicion, but with deep, deliberate awareness. Ethan recognized something in that stare, a reflection of himself not in form, but in essence. They moved to a nearby bench beneath a sprawling tree, and for the next hour, the conversation flowed in soft, tentative waves. The boys talked about school, their favorite books, the animals they had seen at the zoo last month. Ethan listened more than he spoke, anchoring each detail like a life raft, marveling at how each boy had already become a distinct world of thoughts, preferences, fears, and wonder. Lena watched from a short distance, not intruding, yet clearly alert to every nuance, every shift in body language, every word spoken or left unsaid. At one point, Leo launched into an impromptu story about a classmate who claimed to have seen a spaceship land behind the gym. His animated retelling drew giggles from Noah and a rare chuckle from Eli. Ethan smiled, not just at the story, but at the sound of their laughter, a sound he had never known he missed until he heard it for the first time. These moments, he realized, were not loud. They were not dramatic. They were soft and fleeting. They lived in the quiet between heartbeats. Eventually, the questions began, carefully worded at first, but direct in the way only children can be. Noah wanted to know where Ethan had been, not in accusation but in logic, like a scientist piecing together a puzzle. Ethan responded with honesty, the kind that children understand better than adults. He said he hadn't known, that he should have, that he was sorry. No excuses, no elaboration. Just the truth, offered without defense. The boys took in his words silently, each processing them in their own way. Then Eli, who had been quiet all morning, surprised everyone. He asked if Ethan played the piano. When Ethan replied that he used to, and that his grandmother had taught him, the boy nodded slowly and said that he played too. That perhaps, if there was time, they could play something together. Ethan didn't speak for a moment. He only nodded, understanding the weight of that invitation, the trust it carried. As the sun began to tilt westward, Lena gathered the boys with a gentle reminder that lunch was waiting at home. Goodbyes were soft, unhurried. Ethan crouched again as they prepared to leave, and each boy offered a parting gesture. Noah with a firm handshake, Leo with a high five that turned into a half hug, and Eli with a small smile and a quiet, "See you soon." Then they were gone, their small figures disappearing down the path, sunlight catching in their dark curls. Ethan remained on the bench long after the sound of their voices faded. He sat motionless, his hands resting on his knees, his heart no longer racing, but heavy with something new, not regret, not even sadness, but a kind of stillness he had never known. He had stepped into their world and had not been rejected. That alone was a beginning. He didn't call anyone on the way home. He didn't return to the office. He didn't even check his email. Instead, he walked slowly into his apartment, removed his shoes, and placed the few small drawings the boys had handed him onto his desk. They weren't perfect. Crayon lines wandered. Proportions were strange, but in each one there were 4 figures. Always 4. Always him included. The quiet was different now, not empty, not hollow, but alive, like a breath held between one chapter and the next. The morning of the wedding arrived wrapped in silence, not the kind born of peace, but the heavy, stagnant, quiet of things unsaid and undone. The estate grounds, meticulously prepared for a ceremony that would never take place, shimmered under the bright, uncaring sun. Rows of white chairs faced an altar, adorned with cascading orchids, ribbons gently shifting in the breeze. From above, the scene still looked perfect, a frame fit for glossy pages and curated social feeds. But within the hollow space at its center, the truth sat like a stone at the bottom of a lake. Ethan was not there. By the time the first guests began to arrive, he had already met with Isabel, the woman he had once imagined standing beside him in this moment. Their conversation, brief and quiet, had taken place the night before in the sitting room of her suite. She had sensed something changing long before he confessed it. A distance in his tone, a hesitation in their plans. Still, she had not expected the reason to arrive with such gravity. He told her about Lena, about the boys, about the truth that had reached him too late, and how nothing, not even the perfect optics of their union, could now compete with the reality of what he had found. Isabel listened in composed silence, her face trained over years to reveal only what she chose. When he was finished, she didn't cry or argue. She simply said she hoped he found what he was looking for, then asked him to leave. And he did. Not out of cruelty, but out of the deepest kind of respect. Now, as guests whispered and coordinators scrambled to explain the indefinite postponement, Ethan stood alone in his study, the same space where he had once plotted every move of his carefully constructed empire. Today, the silence was of his own choosing. No press release had been issued, no official statement drafted. For now, it was enough to let the moment collapse under its own weight. He stared at the wedding suit hanging untouched behind glass, then turned away and opened the drawer where he had kept Lena's original invitation, now joined by 3 hand-drawn cards, one from each boy, hastily created but given with earnest pride. He read their names again, his fingers tracing the crayon lines like scripture. Noah, Leo, Eli. These names no longer lived only on paper. They had voices, laughter, stories. They belonged to real lives unfolding just a few miles away. Later that afternoon, he stepped outside for the first time since dawn, not to face cameras or crowds, but to walk. Without direction, without agenda, just one foot in front of the other, moving through a city that had never really known him beyond headlines and valuation figures. He found himself near the park again, though he didn't go in. Instead, he sat on a bench nearby, watching other families pass. Fathers lifting toddlers onto shoulders, mothers chasing wobbling bicycles, voices raised in joy or frustration, but always tethered by love. The ache returned then, low and persistent. For years, he had told himself that legacy was built in stocks and patents, in growth charts and market dominance. But now, the truest measure of his legacy was the fact that 3 children had grown without him, and the only way forward was to be present, not perfectly, but honestly. He returned home before sunset and found himself in front of the piano, untouched for years. He opened the lid, pressed a single key, and let the note ring out into the room. It was slightly out of tune, imperfect. He played a second note, then a third, and soon, without planning, a melody emerged, halting, simple. Familiar. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. He remembered it not because it was complex, but because it was the first piece his grandmother had taught him. He imagined Eli's small fingers trying to mimic it, the same way his once had. The following day, he called Lena, not to ask, but to tell her he wanted to see them again. No meetings, no interruptions, just dinner, something simple. She agreed, and the relief in her voice was subtle but real. That evening, he arrived at their modest home carrying 3 small boxes. Nothing extravagant, but each one thoughtful. A set of polished stones for Noah, a miniature robotic kit for Leo, and for Eli, sheet music printed in large, easy-to-read notes. The boys greeted him with energy and curiosity, already more comfortable than they had been just days before. They led him through their living room, showing off drawings and books, reciting facts about their school projects. Their world was colorful and messy and alive, so unlike the sterile, precision-driven life Ethan had curated for himself. And as he sat at their dinner table, eating pasta that Lena had made and listening to Eli hum softly at the piano, something shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once, but unmistakably. It was in the way Leo reached for his hand without hesitation, in the way Noah corrected him gently when he mispronounced a Pokemon's name, and in the way Eli paused mid-song to ask if he could come back tomorrow. The trust was not instant, but it was blooming, tender, and real. After dinner, the boys presented him with another surprise, new drawings, freshly made that afternoon. In each picture, he was there, not in a suit, not behind a podium, but simply present, holding a book, pushing a swing, sitting on a couch. Normal, human, a part of their world. When it came time to say goodnight, the boys wrapped their arms around him, not as guests, not as strangers, but as something closer. He stood in their doorway long after they had fallen asleep, watching the steady rise and fall of 3 small chests. So much of their lives had already happened without him. But what remained, what still could be, was up to him now. Lena joined him quietly at the doorway, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. It was not forgiveness that passed between them, but understanding. She had made the best choices she could, with the information she had. And now, he would have to do the same. Back at his apartment later that night, he didn't pour a drink or turn on the television. He returned to the piano instead, where the final notes of the lullaby still echoed faintly in memory. He played it again, slowly this time, letting the melody settle into his bones. It wasn't about perfection, it was about presence. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt like enough. The days that followed unfolded like pages turning in a book, long left unopened. Each visit with the boys brought with it a new layer, a new chapter in a life Ethan had only just begun to inhabit. With each passing afternoon, his world, once defined by shareholders and quarterly targets, was now grounded in spelling tests, dinosaur trivia, and the delicate precision of Eli's fingers on piano keys. There was a stillness to it all, not the absence of movement, but the presence of meaning in motion. It was a life not chased but received, not engineered but embraced. Ethan had begun to make space. Not just in his calendar, though that had changed too, but in the very architecture of his life. A playmat now lay in his living room beside floor-to-ceiling windows that once only looked out onto the city skyline. A tiny pair of sneakers had found their way near his front door, left behind after a weekend trip to the Science Museum with Leo. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon now, from the cookies Noah had insisted they bake together, a task Ethan had failed at gloriously, though his son had declared the burnt batch almost perfect, with the unflinching generosity only a child could offer. He had also changed the walls. The carefully curated art, once selected by a designer with an eye for minimalism and expense, had been replaced in several spots by framed drawings, crayon portraits mostly, of improbable animals and multicolored skies, but each one bore evidence of their belief that he belonged among them, that he was part of their picture now. At the office, the transformation was equally profound. Miguel had transitioned into his new leadership role with a calm that reassured the board, while Laura, sharp, organized, endlessly capable, had quietly become the backbone of day-to-day operations. Ethan no longer arrived before dawn or stayed until midnight. Meetings were shorter, more focused. He delegated with intention, not hesitation, and when people asked where he was going at 4:30 on a Thursday, he answered plainly, "Dinner with my sons." Some accepted this shift, without comment, others with quiet envy, but no one challenged it. Ethan had not become softer. He had become clearer. He had not lost his edge, only redirected it. And though the financial pages speculated about his withdrawal or his personal rebalancing, Ethan didn't respond. For once, public interpretation did not dictate private truth. Still, the past did not let go so easily. It came back to him on a Tuesday morning in the form of a discreet envelope slid onto his desk by a receptionist who looked too nervous to explain. Inside was a single letter, handwritten in perfect script, unsigned but unmistakable in tone. The words were measured, graceful, and cold. A parting statement from a woman who had once called herself his mentor, Sophia. She claimed no regret, only conviction. She framed her actions as sacrifice, as necessity, as service to something greater than either of them, the empire they had built. She spoke of legacy, of image, of preserving what he had not yet understood was at risk. She never mentioned the boys by name. Not once. Ethan folded the letter and placed it in the drawer where he kept things that no longer required his attention. Not to forget, but to remember what should never be repeated. That evening, he arrived at Lena's house just before dinner. The boys were already in the yard, racing through piles of fallen leaves, their laughter carving warm shapes into the cooling dusk. Lena was in the kitchen, her sleeves rolled, her hands dusted with flour. She looked up and smiled as he entered, and for a moment there was no past between them, only the simple reality of now. She offered him a spoonful of sauce to taste, and he nodded his approval with exaggerated solemnity, making her laugh. These small moments had become their language, their way of learning each other again, outside the frame of what once was and what had never been. Over dinner, the boys took turns reciting pieces from their week. Noah had scored the highest in his class on a math quiz and explained each question in minute detail. Leo had created a comic book hero called Captain Brainstorm and insisted on acting out the first 5 pages. Eli, more reserved, simply said he had composed a new tune and would like to play it later, if everyone was okay with that. Ethan listened with a kind of reverence that defied explanation. Every word was a brick in the foundation of something, sacred and new. Later, as the boys climbed into bed, each insisting on their unique nighttime routine, Ethan lingered in the hallway, leaning against the wall outside their room. Lena joined him a few minutes later, her voice soft, asking if he had a moment to talk. He nodded, and they stepped into the quiet of the back porch. She spoke first. About the unexpected ease of this arrangement, the way the boys had folded Ethan into their lives without resistance, and how she, too, was adjusting to what that meant. Then, cautiously, she mentioned Javier, the quiet, patient man who had once stood beside her during long hospital shifts and rainy afternoons of doubt. She said he had stepped back voluntarily, understanding that something unspoken was reshaping itself between her and Ethan. Not necessarily romantic, not yet, but rooted in something deeper than desire. Ethan didn't press. He only said he was grateful. For her patience, for her strength, for the life she had built in his absence, and the grace with which she was now allowing him to enter it. As he drove home later that night, he realized he had left behind something critical. Not at the house, but in his thinking. The version of himself that had been obsessed with perfection, with success, with being seen as invulnerable. That man had missed birthdays, laughter, scraped knees, and bedtime stories. That man had lost more than he ever admitted. And finally, he was ready to let him go. By the time he returned to his apartment, the city lights no longer dazzled. They simply glowed. He walked past the piano and paused. For a brief moment, he considered playing, but instead he picked up a piece of paper. From the table, a schedule of upcoming parent-teacher conferences Lena had given him, and began to mark the dates into his calendar, one by one, with care. Because what we leave behind is not always failure. Sometimes it is simply the beginning of something better. The week began like any other, with the comforting repetition of new routines, school drop-offs, shared dinners, and the tentative construction of trust between a father and the children he was still learning to understand. Yet beneath the surface of that growing stability, a tremor waited, unseen, but not unfelt. It began with a message. Not from Lena, not from the school, not even from someone Ethan recognized. The email came from an encrypted address and contained only a single line of text. You should know there's more Sophia never told you. Attached was a file. No name, no context, just a dense string of numbers and letters. Ethan stared at it for a long time before opening it, unsure whether it was a trap or a clue. What he found was neither, and both. The document was a scanned internal memo from 6 years ago, bearing the watermark of AH Technologies' legal department. It detailed a meeting between Sophia and an unnamed PR consultant. The subject line read Potential Paternity Risk and Image Containment Strategy. As Ethan scrolled through the pages, the words struck like hammers. In the event that Carmen Garcia proceeds with legal action or attempts public disclosure, the following measures must be taken. Below it, a bulleted list of reputational risks, projected media fallout, and a strategy to reframe any future discovery of the children as a recent development. He felt his chest tighten. Not from surprise, he had already suspected the extent of Sophia's manipulation, but from the realization that it hadn't just been personal interference. It had been orchestrated, institutional, systemic. Others had known. Others had participated. The next few hours passed in a haze. He forwarded the file to Miguel, requesting a confidential legal review. He cleared the rest of his day's meetings. But more than anything, he felt the weight of betrayal, reconfigure itself. It was no longer about being kept from his children. It was about how many hands had helped hold the door shut. That evening, he debated whether to tell Lena. Part of him wanted to protect her from the ugliness of corporate self-preservation, to shield the boys from the knowledge that they had been classified as liabilities before they were even born. But another part, the part that was learning to measure strength not in silence but in honesty, knew the truth could not be buried again. He arrived at Lena's home later than usual, bringing a small stack of books the boys had requested from the library. As they pored over the new titles, one about sharks, another about planets, and a third with stickers of musical instruments, he sat quietly, answering their questions with a distracted warmth that Lena noticed almost immediately. Once, the boys were asleep. She joined him on the porch where he told her everything, about the email, about the document, about how deeply the company, his company, had been involved in keeping them apart. She listened without interrupting, her arms folded, not in anger, but in defense. When he finished, she didn't speak for a long time. Then, with a calm that unsettled, "Him more than any outburst," she said. "This is exactly why I stopped trying. I knew there were walls I'd never get through. I just didn't know how many people had helped build them." Ethan tried to respond, but found himself unable to offer anything that wouldn't sound hollow. Lena didn't expect an apology. She expected integrity. "I'm going to make it public," he said finally. "Not the boys, not our private lives, but the truth about what was done. People should know. Investors, employees, everyone. AH Tech has a future, but it needs to be built on something real." She nodded, then added, "Just promise me one thing. Whatever noise this causes, don't let it drown them out. They need you steady, not fighting shadows." He agreed, and for the next 3 days, he worked quietly, but relentlessly. Miguel assembled a legal team to review all internal communications related to Sophia's actions. Laura helped prepare a statement of corporate accountability, one that acknowledged past errors without deflecting blame. The company's general counsel resigned quietly. There were no press releases, no headlines yet, but within the walls of AH Tech, a shift had begun, one that would eventually ripple outward. Ethan kept showing up. He was at every school pickup, at every dinner, at every bedtime. The boys never saw the storm building around them. They only knew their father was there. And then came the leak. An anonymous source, likely someone from the now dismantled inner circle of Sophia's advisors, provided excerpts of the memo to a prominent tech journalist. The article dropped on a Thursday morning with a headline that made Ethan's heart sink. "Paternity, Power, and the Price of Silence, Inside AH Tech's Hidden Scandal." Though the article didn't name Lena or the children, it painted a damning portrait of corporate strategy overriding human decency. Calls flooded in, journalists, investors, former board members. Ethan declined all interviews. Instead, he posted a single message on his personal page. "The truth matters. It always did. We can't undo the past, but we can face it, transparently, decently, humanly." Then he turned off his phone and went to pick up his sons. At the school gate, he saw Lena waiting too. She gave him a look that held both challenge and approval. The boys came running, arms outstretched, questions spilling out about snacks and soccer and which dinosaurs had feathers. Later that night, as the boys slept and the world continued spinning outside their small home, Lena sat beside Ethan in the quiet. "You're not who I thought you were," she said softly, not unkindly. He looked over, waiting. "You're better." The storm, when it came, did not flatten everything in its path. It did not shout or tear down walls with spectacle. It arrived in quiet waves of consequence. The Apoy headlines grew less frequent with each passing day, and public interest slowly turned elsewhere, consumed by newer stories, fresher scandals. H-Tech weathered the disruption, not unscathed, but intact. Investors remained, more cautious perhaps, but reassured by the transparency that followed. Internally, the company culture began to shift, no longer driven by fear of exposure, but by the promise of redemption. For Ethan, the noise faded, but something quieter lingered, a re-evaluation not just of what had happened, but of what could still become. At home, the rhythm he and Lena had carved out became more natural, more stable, like music that no longer needed to follow a strict tempo. The boys continued to thrive. Noah had begun writing short stories, full of imagination and unlikely endings. Leo, ever the performer, was now recording his own science shows on a toy camera Ethan had found in an old storage box. And Eli, sweet, careful Eli, was composing simple pieces on a borrowed keyboard, each melody a soft echo of feelings he didn't yet have words for. Ethan found himself humming those notes at odd hours, as though his son's music had infiltrated his bloodstream, reminding him of the fragile beauty of connection. On a rainy afternoon in late March, Ethan and Lena sat beneath the covered porch while the boys played quietly inside. The rain tapped gently on the roof, a rhythm steady enough to soothe. Neither of them spoke for a while. Silence had become easier between them, no longer a space to fill, but a space to rest in. It was Ethan who broke it, not with a declaration or a question, but with something softer. He told her he'd been thinking about moving. Not away, not far, just closer. A house maybe, with space for the boys when they stayed over. A room where Eli could keep his piano. Somewhere that wasn't borrowed from a life that no longer fit him. Lena listened without flinching. She asked about the details, the logistics. He had already made notes, of course, locations, school zoning, even ideas for a small garden that Leo could turn into a dinosaur dig site. She smiled at that. Not everything needed to be decided right away, but the idea hung in the air like possibility, and neither of them pushed it away. A few days later, while flipping through a sketch pad, Ethan found a page Noah had labeled Our Family. The drawing was clumsy, childlike, beautiful. There were 5 figures, not 4, not 6. The parents stood side by side, the children in front of them, smiling. Ethan recognized himself not by detail, but by posture. Upright, calm, hand held loosely in Lena's. What struck him wasn't the accuracy, but the intention. In Noah's world, they were already whole. No instructions, no disclaimers. Time passed, not quickly, but surely. And as spring edged into summer, Ethan made his move, literally and emotionally. He found a modest home 3 streets over from Lena's, close enough for the boys to bike between the two. It had a sunlit living room, a backyard with uneven grass, and a room that Eli immediately claimed for his piano. The house felt unfamiliar in its simplicity. It also felt right. They celebrated the boys' 6th birthday with a small party in that backyard. There was cake shaped like a volcano, balloons that tangled in the trees, and a treasure hunt designed by Leo, who insisted on hiding clues in impossible places. Friends came, neighbors lingered, laughter filled the space that had once been empty. Ethan stood beside Lena as they watched the boys unwrap handmade cards and a board game from Miguel, who now visited regularly, not as a colleague, but as a family friend. There were no photographers, no press, just the quiet witness of something ordinary and profound. A family unfolding, not despite the past, but because of what they had chosen to become together. Later that night, after everyone had left and the boys had fallen into an exhausted sleep, Ethan found himself standing in the kitchen beside Lena. The room smelled of frosting and candle wax. There was still confetti in the corners. They didn't speak for a while. Then he turned to her and asked the question that had been growing, quietly, naturally, for weeks. He didn't phrase it like a proposal. There was no box, no speech, only a question born from stillness and certainty. What would it look like, not now, but someday, for them to build something permanent, not in response to what they had lost, but in celebration of what they had found. Lena didn't answer right away. Instead, she poured 2 glasses of water, handed him one, and leaned against the counter beside him. She said she didn't know, that it was too early to know, that the boys needed stability first, consistency, more time with him as their father, before anything else. But then she looked at him and said something else. That she wasn't afraid of the question, that she didn't reject the idea of someday, that the door wasn't closed. It wasn't a yes, but it was far from a no. It was an answer that honored the truth. Some things aren't meant to be rushed. Some loves grow slowly, like roots underground, invisible at first, but real, strong, alive. As they stood there, not holding hands, not kissing, just sharing the air between them, Ethan realized something he hadn't been able to name before. Redemption wasn't a moment. It wasn't a grand gesture or an apology offered under rain. It was this. It was showing up, again and again. It was listening. It was helping with homework. It was letting go of pride. It was staying through silence. And most of all, it was letting love arrive in its own time. Outside, the wind shifted. The trees whispered like they knew something was coming. Inside, a man who had once believed success was everything began to understand what it really meant to win. By the time summer settled over the city like a warm exhale, Ethan's life bore little resemblance to the one he had lived just a few months earlier. The glass tower still stood downtown, and Tech continued to pulse with ambition and innovation. But the man who had once defined himself entirely by its success now moved through the world with different coordinates. Meetings still happened, emails still poured in, but the center of gravity had shifted. It was no longer the company, but the people who had drawn him back to something far more difficult and far more meaningful than prestige. The house he now called home buzzed with quiet transformation. The boys adapted quickly, as children often do when love provides the scaffolding. They came and went between the 2 houses, their backpacks and imaginations trailing behind them like comets. Some days they helped Ethan plant vegetables in the crooked backyard beds, though most of what they managed to grow was laughter and mud. Other days, they simply sprawled across the living room floor, building impossible cities from mismatched Lego bricks and narrating adventures that spanned galaxies. Ethan began to learn their rhythms, the cadence of their moods, the invisible signals that preceded frustration or fatigue. He also learned when to step back, when to sit quietly and let them lead. There were moments of strain, of course. Parenting wasn't a series of hallmark scenes. It was mess and monotony and repetition. There were tears over broken toys, arguments, over screen time and bedtime routines that felt more like negotiations between diplomats. Ethan sometimes caught himself reaching for his phone out of habit, fingers hovering over work messages that no longer felt urgent. But each time he reminded himself, this was the long game. This was what mattered. He saw Lena almost every day now, not always alone, and not always for long. Sometimes they simply exchanged updates during pickup, or shared a quiet meal while the boys watched cartoons in the other room. There was still space between them, but it was no longer defined by loss. It was intentional, respectful, careful, not out of fear, but out of hope. They had begun to co-parent with a kind of unspoken grace, listening more than correcting, collaborating, without competition. It was a new kind of partnership, built not on shared ambition, but shared responsibility. The foundation Ethan had envisioned, Nouveau Pathways, was now more than just a legal document. It had a board, a mission statement, and a growing network of volunteers. Its purpose had become personal, to provide support systems for single parents in tech and science fields, mentorship, childcare assistance, flexible funding. Lena had joined as a core advisor and helped shape the community outreach framework. Her ideas were rooted in lived experience, practical and clear-eyed, and the board quickly recognized that she wasn't just there for moral support, She was essential to the foundation's soul, but not everyone welcomed the change in Ethan with open arms. Some former colleagues viewed his pivot as a weakness, a distraction from legacy. One investor even suggested during a closed-door meeting that fatherhood might dilute Ethan's strategic edge. Ethan didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply looked the man in the eye and told him that if clarity, purpose, and connection were liabilities, then perhaps the company needed fewer sharp edges and more open hands. The room fell silent. The meeting ended early. The real test, though, didn't come from boardrooms or headlines. It came one ordinary Tuesday evening when Noah returned from school carrying a folded paper and a furrowed brow. His teacher had assigned a project on families, drawing a family tree, complete with photos and stories. It was meant to be a celebration, but Ethan recognized the tension in Noah's shoulders immediately. He waited until after dinner, when the other boys were occupied, and asked Noah what was wrong. Noah hesitated, then unfolded the paper, revealing a template filled with empty boxes and connecting lines. He said he didn't know where to put everyone. He said he didn't want to hurt anyone's feelings. He said it felt like choosing sides. Ethan sat beside him for a long time before answering. He told Noah that families didn't always fit into diagrams, that sometimes love didn't follow straight lines, that what mattered wasn't where you wrote the names, but why they were there. They filled out the tree together, bending the rules. Lena's name appeared next to his, but not as spouse. Instead, they used partner in parenting. Javier's name was there too, with a small note, important adult in our lives. The boys' names stood proudly at the roots, connected by all the branches above them, not bound by convention, but supported by care. Later, Ethan shared the moment with Lena. She listened, touched but unsurprised. The boys, she said, were learning something most adults never did. That identity isn't a grid, it's a constellation. That truth isn't rigid, it's relational. A week later, during a board presentation at Nouveau Pathways, Ethan used that same metaphor. He spoke about constellations, not as fixed signs in the sky, but as ways we give shape to meaning. The room fell into a hush as he described how his own life had once orbited success, until 3 small stars rearranged everything. That's what the foundation was now, a chance to help others chart new paths, even when the old maps no longer served. It wasn't a speech designed to impress. It was a declaration of belief, and it marked a quiet shift, not just in how others saw him, but in how he had come to see himself. He was no longer a man haunted by the years he had lost. He was a father present in the ones he had left, a partner in progress, a builder, no longer of empires, but of something far more enduring. Autumn arrived slowly, as if reluctant to disturb what had finally begun to settle. The days shortened, imperceptibly at first, then all at once. Leaves shifted from green to amber, and the air began to carry that crisp, quiet edge only October can hold. In Ethan's neighborhood, pumpkins began to appear on porches, each one a signal of tradition, of preparation, of time moving forward. And for once, he didn't feel like he was chasing it. He was living inside it. By now, the rhythms of his new life felt almost instinctive. The boys moved easily between houses, their routines flowing with more confidence and less correction. School drop-offs had turned from logistics into moments, small exchanges of warmth, reminders of presence. He had learned how to make Eli's oatmeal just the way he liked it, which spoon was Leo's favorite, how to fold Noah's drawings into his backpack without creasing them. These details, invisible to the world, had become the architecture of Ethan's days. They were not acts of performance. They were acts of devotion. Lena had become, not again a romantic partner, but something more necessary, a witness, a collaborator in the quiet heroism of raising children with integrity. Their conversations now carried ease, even when they disagreed, which they sometimes did. But now there was space for disagreement without fear of fracture. They were no longer two halves of a broken whole. They were whole people building something larger than themselves. One Sunday afternoon, while the boys were at a sleepover birthday party, Lena invited Ethan to the old university campus where they had once shared coffee, notes, dreams that stretched far beyond what either of them could define back then. The place had changed. New benches, a renovated library, but something in the air felt familiar. They walked slowly past the courtyard, now quieter than it once was, their steps slow and unhurried. It was Lena who said it first, that she wasn't sure what came next for them, but she knew she wanted to keep building toward it, even if neither of them had the full blueprint. It wasn't a declaration, nor a warning. It was an offering. Ethan listened, not with the urgency of a man waiting for permission, but with the patience of someone who had learned the value of slow truths. He told her that he didn't need promises, that what they had now, the partnership, the peace, the shared purpose, was already more than he had believed himself capable of. And whatever grew from here, it would not come from trying to fix the past, but from honoring the present. They sat for a while on one of the newer benches, just watching the light shift between tree branches. The silence between them no longer asked to be filled. It simply was. And in that quiet, something unspoken passed between them. Not a conclusion, but an understanding. That whatever they were it together. That evening, when Ethan returned home, he found a small envelope. In the mailbox addressed in Noah's handwriting. Inside was a folded sheet of paper, a class assignment titled, "What My Family Means to Me." It wasn't long, just a few sentences, but each one was steady and full of clarity. Noah had written about his mom, his brothers, and his dad. About bedtime stories, weekend pancakes, and family movie nights where no one agreed on what to watch. He had finished with a line that caught Ethan's breath. "My family is where I feel the most like myself." Ethan placed the paper in a frame and set it beside the boy's earlier drawings on the shelf above his desk. It didn't erase the years he had lost, but it gave shape to the ones he was now living fully. He no longer wondered what could have been. He focused on what was, and what could still be. The following Saturday, they hosted a backyard picnic. Nothing elaborate, just neighbors, some friends from the foundation, and a few families from the boys' school. There were homemade cookies, lawn games, and a folding table piled with mismatched plates and napkins. Lena brought lemonade. The boys orchestrated a chaotic but surprisingly well-rehearsed play about astronauts and talking cats. Miguel came too, bringing a kite he'd insisted was for educational aerodynamics, though it was mostly an excuse to run across the grass like a child again. As the sun dipped low, casting everything in that warm, forgiving light that makes ordinary things seem profound, Ethan stood with a cup of lukewarm coffee and looked around. There was laughter in every direction. Leo was explaining something wildly inaccurate about comets to anyone who would listen. Eli sat with a classmate at the piano keyboard they'd dragged outside, playing a soft melody almost lost in the breeze. And Noah, now taller than he'd been when this all began, was helping serve cookies, wearing a serious expression that mirrored Ethan's own. There had been no ceremony, no milestone, no banner announcing that something monumental had happened, and yet it had. In the quiet accumulation of consistent love, in the daily choices to show up, to apologize, to listen, Ethan had not only rebuilt something, he had built it differently, better. That night, after everyone had gone and the backyard returned to stillness, Ethan walked through the house, checking on the boys one by one. Leo had fallen asleep upside down on his bed, arms spread like wings. Eli still clutched the music notebook he'd been scribbling in. Noah had left his door ajar, his reading lamp casting soft shadows on the wall. Ethan stood there for a while, letting the silence wash over him. Then he went downstairs, made himself a cup of tea, and sat by the window. watching the wind play with the trees. He thought of what the future might hold. There would be more questions, more transitions, maybe even more heartbreak. But there would also be music and drawings and laughter shared over burnt toast and spilled juice. There would be mornings when the house felt too small for all the dreams it now contained. And there would be nights like this, when nothing needed to happen because everything already had. In the space he once filled with ambition, now lived something quieter, deeper. A sense of arrival, not at the pinnacle of success, but at the center of something true. He didn't know what came next, but he was no longer afraid of the unknown. He had come home, not to a place but to a role, a rhythm, a life, and it was enough.